Hey, welcome back to the channel. It is time for episode 3 of our read-along of John Langan's The Wide Carnivorous Sky and Other Monstrous Geographies. I think last week I said monstrosity, so forgive me. But we are diving into the title story of this entire anthology. And let me bring up the book itself. So I did take some notes. I will try to remember what these notes meant. I was a little bit behind reading this thing. I just finished last night, so bear with me, but there's some cool stuff to talk about here. First, I should talk about, this was a departure from everything we've read, with the exception of Kids, the very first short story in this collection. And that is that this is told in a very standard format in third-person past tense, where the last couple have been very different. One being in second person as we're being addressed in Technicolor, and then the one before that in somewhat of a play format. So I was, as I said, really anxious to see what his style was in standard third person, and I like it. I like it so far. So let's dig into this weird story. I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is the setting. So this is in the Middle East, I believe Iraq. And I've always found settings like that, Middle Eastern settings, underused for things like horror, because there's a lot of interesting stuff in their mythology and just the settings in general that lend itself to something very creepy. Like I believe my first note here, I state that it reminds me of the Song of Kali, which was a Dan Simmons horror novel that I enjoyed. I read that many years ago, but if you haven't checked that out, it takes place in Calcutta, and needless to say, it's interesting read and quite creepy. And so this story, we follow this group of soldiers, our POV character being Davis, but I love the opening chapter. We just have 9:13 p.m. and we have all these soldiers just sitting around this campfire talking about how they're going to kill this creature, which they say, so it's a vampire. I did not say a vampire. So it's a vampire-like creature, as you know, but I'm really glad that John Langan didn't go down that road. I'm very tired of vampires. I've never really been into vampires. They've been played out for me for essentially ever. I mean, there's a couple of films and books, obviously, that are decent, but never been into them. So I'm very glad that this did not go that way. It created some kind of strange alien-like beast that does feed on blood, but exists in some kind of spaceship-like coffin thing, which was kind of a cool touch. Although weird, you know, a lot of this kind of reminds me of Lovecraft work, where it's not so much about horrors that exist on Earth, but cosmic horror, and that's always a cool place to go, because really nothing on Earth is going to be as alien as something in space. But anyway, I thought this was a great hook paragraph. I mean, it's in media res. We're right in the action. We hear the crackling of this campfire as these guys are talking about it, and then we delve into the past when they're on a tour in Iraq, and they encounter this thing. And this highlight here is when they first have that moment where they can kind of see through its eyes, which was kind of a cool concept. But the courtyard wasn't. I was somewhere high, like 100 miles high, so far up I could see the curve of the earth below me, clouds, continents, the ocean. What you see in the pictures they take from orbit, stars, space, all around me, directly overhead, a little farther away than you are from me. There was this thing. I don't know what the fuck it was. Big, long, maybe long as a house. It bulged in the middle, tapered at the ends. The surface was dark, shiny. Does that make any sense? The thing was covered in, it looked like some kind of lacquer. Maybe it was made out of the lacquer. Anyway, one moment my head's about to crack open, my teeth are chattering, my skin's blue, and I'm in outer space. The next, all that's gone, I'm back to the courtyard and the shadow. The thing is ripping the hostiles to shreds. So that was kind of our first glimpse of this strange cosmic creature, I guess. And I'm glad they never really explain it. A lot of the soldiers here try to come up with reasons or explanations how this thing came to be, or maybe where it came from, but we never really truly discover it. We also, I should might add, that I'm really glad it was never described in intricate detail. I think that's one failing of horror writers, is when you describe things so much that it leaves nothing to the imagination. And I think really the unseen in horror, or the little seen in horror, is what makes it truly frightening. It's where you can't quite see every detail. And I'm a huge horror fan, but honestly, there's really not a lot of good horror films out there, and a lot of horror films fail to realize that fact. They show the monster in its entirety, in all clarity, and it ceases to be as frightening as it was when it was kind of lurking in the shadows. And the next note I have here, and this is kind of appeals to the setting, but I don't know if you guys have ever seen the film Dog Soldiers. It's about a bunch of soldiers in a forest, and they're dealing with werewolves, and so this really reminded me of that because, you know, again, that's what I really enjoy about the story too, is that it's not your typical setting. You have a bunch of soldiers in the middle of a desert, in the middle of an Iraqi war, dealing with some kind of creature, and so it's something you really don't experience a whole lot in horror. And I like settings like this. I like settings like Dog Soldiers, and then, you know, them being up against werewolves. It's just kind of a concept you don't really see too often. I mean, normally when you're encountering werewolves and vampires, it's to be expected. It's either Eastern Europe or it's in some rundown castle or manor somewhere. But I think changing up the setting here really made it a lot more interesting than it could have been otherwise. I mean, imagine this story with just kind of a what you expect cast of characters, and I think it would be a very different experience. And I highlighted these sections because, you know, I'm a writer nerd, obviously, and, you know, I know some of you guys are out there, but I really enjoyed these similes here, where he's describing this vicious attack of everybody, someone opening up like a Christmas present, him turtling on his back, swung against his head like a ball player aiming for the stands. And this is something that I think about quite often when you're describing stuff from a character's POV. All of the narrative should be in their POV, and these similes really speak to that character, Davis, who's witnessing all of this. So nothing really story related. I just thought it was a cool thing he did. Oh, and before I move on, another cool thing he did was I noticed a lot in this, and I really enjoy it too, where he's kind of mixing stream of consciousness thought of the character with description. And so you can see here, Davis had stared at the sky before. Who has not, but helpless on his back, his spine length of molten steel. His ears full of Manfred whimpering that he was going to die. Oh, sweet Jesus, he was going to fucking die. The lieutenant talking. So you can see there that rather than taking this apart from the sentence and using his dialogue, he intermixed it there to great effect, because it's not as jarring as if you were to have another line break and then have something like dialogue of this guy screaming for his life. And so it's just cool stuff. I mean, I really like his writing style. He's doing a lot of things that I really pay attention to, and it doesn't really take you away from the experience. And I think that's what we're all trying to do, right? When we write stuff, trying to keep people as engaged as we can. And here's another thing that was kind of cool in writing. So he's talking about an episode, I believe, here, and it ends on, well, let me read the previous one. With the second push of his feet, blah, 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 blah. Each subsequent interaction, extension of his legs, ratcheted the hurt up one more degree until he was lying on a bed of fire this time. And then it goes into dialogue. We have a paragraph break, and then it immediately goes into, this time my vision didn't blur, it cracked. So I thought that was a really cool transition, going for something from narrative description to dialogue, and in fact, sometimes I'll do something like that, but it'll be within the actual scene itself. Whereas here, it was a complete break into a new chapter and a new timeline, which is pretty neat. And here is where we discover that strange power of the vampire. Well, I shouldn't call it a vampire, but the creature, the shadow, as they call it. Where again, you have this side effect of this thing where you can kind of see through it. So whether by accident or design, the vampire's appearance is accompanied by a telepathic jolt that momentarily disorients its intended victims, rendering them easier prey. For those who survive the meeting, a nod at them. A link remains that may be activated by persistent pronounced stress. Whether physical or mental, the result of this activation is a period of clairvoyance, during which the lucky individual rides along for the vampire's current activities. Whether the vampire usually has equal access to our perceptions during this time is unclear. Our combined account suggests it does not. However, there are exceptions. So this is very pivotal for the very last scene of the story, when they're all confronting this thing for the final time. And we have a bit of a John Carpenter's The Thing ending, but I'll talk about that when we get there. And I really like this part here. It's when, I think it was the lieutenant talking to Davis, or one of the soldiers. And, you know, I don't have a military background. I don't really know anybody in my immediate family who's been in war or living anymore anyway. And here we got a little glimpse that really stood out to me for kind of a PTSD thing. They're talking about when they're going back for his earning his bachelor's of science. Maybe if I could have stopped worrying about how goddamn exposed I was walking from building to building, I could have focused on something of what the professors were saying. So I know that's not a huge pivotal part of the story or anything, but it really stood out to me for a character moment because I pictured this guy walking on college campus and being exposed, and that's what he's thinking of because he has this PTSD where he's always wondering, he's like, I'm out in the open, I'm an open target. And I just thought that was a little cool aside from a character standpoint, and something that I think really pulled me into the moment, honestly, even though it's, like I said, it's not a major part of the story, but it's a really cool little detail that really stood out to me. And this next quote here is when they're talking about Lee's saying, okay, laughing. Lee said, laughing, all right, the way I see it, this vampire is like the advance for an invasion. It flies around its pod looking for suitable planets, and when it finds one, it parks itself above the surface, calls its buddies, and waits for them to arrive. So I read a series, or actually a couple books in a series called Necroscope years and years ago by Brian Lumley. And if my memory serves me right, I could be completely incorrect here, but the vampires aren't your traditional vampires. They're alien creatures, but act as vampires on Earth in all of the ways we know vampires to act. And again, I think I'd really love to know the influences of this story because I get a lot of Dog Soldiers, I get a lot of Song of Kali, I get Brian Lumley's Necroscope, and I get John Carpenter's The Thing, which, you know, like I said, that comes toward the end. And I've noticed that a couple times. I remember the story before last, obviously the last story was inspired by Poe's Tale, but the one before that, there was an Evil Dead kind of reference in there. At least I imagine it to be. And so I think you can tell here that John Langan is really influenced by a lot of great fiction, both film and literature. And here we are at the end. This is really, again, what hit me with John Carpenter's The Thing, because if you have seen that movie, if you know what I'm talking about. If you have not, the entire base and the Arctic base is destroyed. We have two characters who are surviving. It is smoldering around them, and they don't know if one of them is possessed or the host for this alien being. And so they're just sitting there waiting it out, essentially. And that's where I thought this was going to go. I was like, oh man, this really reminds me of The Thing, that last moment, because we know the lieutenant and Davis are the last surviving people after the encounter with this thing. And he's saying, I don't know how I am, Davis said. No, I can't feel a thing either. And no, I don't want to drink your blood. Is that enough? So they're arguing about, Davis having this vampire inside him, or this creature inside him, or becoming it now. And so they head off after this, and then we end with the lieutenant turned and started walking toward the trees. He did not ask, and Davis did not tell him what he had seen with his eyes closed. He wasn't sure how he could have said that the image behind his eyelids was the same as the image in front of them. The unending sky, blue, ravenous. So I don't know what that means. Does that mean that the vampire's in him? Does that mean does not? Seems to imply that it is. But let me know what you think. I'm really curious. And I always love it when a horror story ends like this, where it's kind of open-ended, where it could continue on. And overall, I really like the story. I don't think it really hit me as hard as the last two, honestly. But there's some nice character moments here. I like there's a moment where the lieutenant, I believe, and Davis are talking about their past. And I believe the lieutenant's father died when he was very young, like 27. And they're talking about, like, is this life worth it? Do they think they lived a fulfilling life? And there's some interesting stuff about, like I said, their families and their children and their relationships. And while that wasn't completely developed into something, it didn't sort of tie back into the ending or the theme of the story. I appreciated it being there. It just really made these characters feel a lot more fleshed out. But yeah, great stuff. Like all these influences, Dog Soldiers, The Thing, Brian Lumley's Necroscope, even possibly, at least that's what I got out of it. And then it was a cool tale in terms of kind of confusing though, a little bit, where we're in the present, then we're in the past, and we kind of flip back and forth between the time and then dates. And we always know that the time is sort of the present, and it's leading up to this final event. So it wasn't too confusing. It took me a few chapters to kind of get what was going on. But yeah, I had a great time. Let me know what your thoughts were in the comments. Is there something that I did not catch or bring up that you would like to discuss further? Because I'm sure there's plenty more things. This was not a short story. I mean, it was a short story, but it was a longer short story, like all of his stuff seems to be. So for next week, I think think we are going to move on to the next story, which is The City of the Dog. I took a look and it seems to be about the length of this one, maybe a little bit shorter, but I think that should be easy enough to get through for the next week. But yeah, I'm continually enjoying this collection. Thank you for the suggestion. I'm getting a lot out of this. I know a lot of times short story anthologies can kind of have some pretty good ones and some not so good ones, but so far I feel like it's a pretty strong collection overall. Let me know in the comments, how are you enjoying it? Are you behind? Are you ahead? Have you read ahead? Do you know something cool that's coming up next? So I look forward to reading The City of the Dog along with you, and I will post my thoughts next week. So until then, have a great week. Thanks. Bye.